Zijn we nu live? Even checken, voordat ik tegen mezelf begin te praten. Live op... Live op Rumble. En op YouTube zijn we... ook live. Gaat het goed? Ja. Excuses, dit is omdat ik voor het eerst gebruik maak van de streaming service van Rumble. Dus ik moet even kijken of alles werkt. Een goede avond. Vandaag een iets ander soort livestream, omdat het vandaag 7 oktober is. Dat wil zeggen 1 jaar na 7 oktober 2023, de datum van de zogenoemde operatie Al-Aqsa flood, overstroming, storm in Nederlands. Waarbij Hamas en andere Palestijnse verzetsmilitanten de grens van Gaza zijn overgestoken en een militaire operatie in Israël hebben uitgevoerd. In het kader daarvan hebben we deze week een andere stream dan normaal gesproken om het hierover te gaan hebben. En ja, hoe beter dat te doen dan door het erover te hebben met mensen die zelf dichter bij wat er gebeurt staan dan 2 white boys uit Nederland. Dus vandaar dat ik vandaag een aantal interessante sprekers op de stream heb, die overigens niet allemaal Nederlands kunnen. Dus we schakelen over op het Engels en achteraf ga ik nog ondertiteling eraan toevoegen, maar dat komt dus later. Daarnaast nog 1 aankondiging. Vanaf heden vindt dit ook een Rumble-kanaal, dus mocht er nu iets worden gezegd tegen Israël, over Israël, wat ervoor zorgt dat ons YouTube-kanaal wordt verwijderd, ik sluit het inmiddels niet meer uit, dan zijn we te vinden op rumble.com/user/vinddit. So, without further ado, here is my panel, which consists of Omar, who is half Tunisian, and Ayman, who is from Lebanon. And there might be some more people joining later on as well. But first we're gonna get started. And I would like to ask both of you to begin this conversation with October 7th, 2023. And specifically, how would you characterize what went on that day? Like, of course, it's being framed universally in Western media as a terrorist attack. I guess people from the Middle East have a different perspective, also depending on what part of the Middle East they're from. So, yeah, how would you guys characterize this this event? Whichever wants to go first.
Well, if I may, and thank you, Sjoerd, for the invitation. Personally speaking, you know, once what's that famous quote? Once a freedom fighter is another one's terrorist. That given, I felt that October 7th was an absolute tragic event. Simultaneously, I felt that it was absolutely inevitable. The problem is not with the suppressed people or the oppressed people, I must say. The problem is with the oppressing force. It's only after so many years that people undoubtedly are going to resist. And I believe it was Nelson Mandela who famously said, we know all too well that our freedom, that we really do not have a freedom as mankind unless the Palestinians are also free. Now, mind you, Nelson Mandela, the human rights fighter of South Africa, was also labeled a terrorist for many, many years. So while I felt that it was tragic that it, in some sense, had to be done, some massive act of resistance had to be performed after years of oppression, I felt that it was absolutely inevitable. And I think now, a year ahead of Al-Aqsa flood, we can definitely see why it was inevitable. The dehumanization of Palestinian lives, Arab lives, really, the absolute disregard for women and children, the bombing of schools, mosques, hospitals. We see now all too well what the Zionist regime is capable of. And I think that, like a famous Israeli historian said in the last few months, I just forgot his name, but he said that, like with any regime, it's going to get worse before it becomes better. But if you ask me about October 7th, really what it was the beginning of the end of the Zionist entity. I think that what you are now starting to see is an Israeli government that the only option they have is to escalate. The moment that they stop escalating, whether it's through bombing Iran or bombing an Iranian embassy or consulate in Damascus, or like we're seeing right now, the disgrace that's happening in Lebanon, the moment they will stop is the moment that their entire society will simply implode. So I think that they know this. I think that they are acutely aware that the moment that they stop fighting, the monster is going to turn inwards. And I think that that's also something that we're already seeing, not just across the Arab world, because the Arab world was already very aware of this injustice towards the Palestinians, and the fact that this Israeli regime is actually able to just exist. But it's also happening in the West. And I think that this is a major shift and something that we can see as a somewhat bright spot now a year into this absolute atrocity.
Yeah, in a very cynical way, maybe. But yeah, I take your point. So Ayman, when last year Operation Al-Aqsa flood happened, what was your response to it? How did you see it?
Okay, I would usually refer to the words of Norman Finkelstein on that day, where he described it as similar to a ghetto uprising. Specifically, he spoke in this terminology, of course, because of his background. His parents being part of ghetto uprisings, Warsaw and can't remember the other one. But the reason why I talk through his words about this is because, as Omar was saying, a lot of people in different parts of the world, and I took a small note on Arab world, and I would change a bit of that, but we will talk about that terminology later, perhaps. A lot of them did see this as something inevitable. And I think historically the relationship of, if we're talking about Israel with Gaza specifically, it has been that of a systematic mowing of the lawn, a systematic small attacks, they're not so small, huh? But compared to what's happening now, smaller attacks that would maintain Gaza as a ghetto. And this being described as an inevitable reaction is one thing, of course, but also seeing it as breaking out of a prison is also something else, because it also contextualizes it more in the form of a historic revolution rather than just one event or one moment. And if we look at it, and I think my Dutch isn't that good yet, but I think from your description in the introduction, you also referred to it as a military operation, which is what, or am I mistaken?
Yeah. So I believe Scott Ritter said October 7th was the most successful military raid in the 21st century.
And coincidentally, today in Abu Ubaida's address public address, Abu Ubaida, for those who do not know, is a spokesperson of Hamas, the military spokesperson of Hamas. He also used the same terminology. He described it as the most successful military operation well, maybe he didn't say the century, but he said something very similar to that meaning. And I did see it as that, but I have to say that in the same moment, I of course immediately thought about the what Israel is gonna react with. So of course that was also one of the immediate things that we were thinking about, because we've seen this reaction before. Of course, perhaps this time is also much greater in many ways, but that was also one of the primary concerns from a perspective of a person that has seen it or experienced it in 2006.
Yes, something I think people mostly living in the West have problems understanding nowadays is that whenever you talk about fighting for liberation, that in that phrase there is the word fighting, and that's not just a word. In real life situations, that necessarily entails real life violence. And whenever real life violence happens, obviously you are going to be able to point to tragic things taking place. But in my view, and you guys can both comment on this, what has really happened in the media coverage last year of October 7th, and in a weird way also the other way around since then, I will explain that in a second, is that there's focus overtly on like violence happened, this is a tragedy, therefore this is evil. However, there is no understanding of why this violence happens and no distinction between violence of the oppressed against the oppressor and violence of the oppressor against the oppressed. So maybe to put a phrase on that, the thing that's really taking place, in my opinion, now people view this, we have a society in the West which is mostly free of violent struggle. So people here have a much harder time understanding that sometimes self-defense violence is necessary, and in self-defensive violence, the victims are not always necessarily the perpetrators of the oppression, but sometimes bystanders, sometimes those who are coming along. Yeah, is there anything you want to say on that comment?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, of course, I agree with this, and of course, many people would agree with this, especially a lot of people in the media, especially all of the, I believe today it's 175 journalists killed by Israel, and I think this kind of shows that through certain direction of the media, it has become much easier for you're talking about a Western audience, them not being, let's say, physically necessarily directly living certain conflicts does not really excuse one not knowing, right? It's not necessarily, because people do know, and I do not want. You're free to generalize. You've lived here much longer than me, of course, but I would not. Let's say I would not make this generalization, because it's also a possibility for me to be aware of the violence that happens elsewhere. It was also a possibility for the Viet Cong to see this link between the Palestinian struggle and their struggle, and to form actual bonds and, well, training bonds, right? In that regard. So in many ways, I think it is the direction that the media has chosen to take in the West that has led to this social acceptance, more or less, of a genocide. Of course, I am not. We see the protests in European streets. I'm not saying that everybody accepts this, but it means that some people have to do a bit of extra work and look at a bit of references that are not usually pushed into your face by mainstream media. And I think this is part of what you're doing on this stream.
if I may add to that, I think that a great example of what you just said is that, for instance, if we look to Germany, you know, not only do we see state media being incredibly in favor of um, the Israeli government, we also, and I know because I have a German mother who always watches his German television, we also see that one Holocaust can actually invite another. You know, you see this kind of generational collective trauma that a country is dealing with, and through their own sense of guilt, they are now not even allowing Palestinian flags to be waved on the streets, whether it's a protest or not. The moment that you wave a Palestinian flag in Germany, it is labeled as an illegal protest and you could get arrested. It's absolutely nuts. But within this field, to also, with this strategy, to also see it as an opportunity, I think is not only inspiring. I also think it's one of the few things that we currently have left. And one of the organizations that keeps inspiring me to a great degree is, for instance, the Jewish Voice of Peace organization that has already been active far before this genocide was happening. But it's these types of organizations, I feel, that in the next 10 to 15 years are really going to be making the difference. Because as we mentioned, and excuse my terminology, perhaps Arab world is not the right terminology here, but as you surely know, everyone in the Middle East knows the truth about the Zionist regime. And it's not that everybody shares the consensus that, you know, we all hate Jews. Nobody really hates Jews. I'm sure that 99% of people in the Middle East have ever met someone of Jewish origin or of a Jewish religion. So really, it more has to do with the oppressed being oppressed, and the Zionist regime having its place in the middle of the Middle East, instead of and it being a Jewish ethno-state, instead of you know, simply Muslims or Arabs hating on the Jewish population because they're Jewish. So I think that if we're going to talk about the framing within the Western media, we should take a specific we should make a specific note of those media, for instance, like the Jewish Voice of Peace, but also Democracy Now!, that are really stepping up in their news headlines, and see where that goes in the next coming of years, even after this whole situation has ended.
Yeah, I think it's not just in terms of the media, but also public perceptions, which is what I was sort of getting at just now. Even if you just look at the Middle East, and please correct me if this is an oversimplification or distortion, but if you look at the Middle Eastern peoples who are the most in solidarity with Palestine, it's the Shiite community in Lebanon, it's the people of Yemen, and it's the resistance militias in Iraq. All three of which are presently or recently engaged, recently as in the past few decades, in a struggle for survival of their communities. So it seems to me that these people are in part most in solidarity with Palestine because they can most see their own fates in the fate of Palestine. Whereas, for example, the people of Saudi Arabia or the people of Egypt or of Jordan, which are, of course, still pro-Palestinian, but they're not overthrowing their basically comprador governments, which try to normalize with Israel. And if you take the same dynamic and look at Europe, the first two countries which really had taken sort of significant steps in the UN in supporting Palestine are Spain and Ireland. And of course, Ireland has itself fought an anti-colonial struggle in our parents' lifetimes. And in Spain, these kinds of struggles are also very recently have been part of people's daily life experience. Other places in Europe don't have this. So, and then maybe specifically getting at Lebanon and Hezbollah, which has been engaged in such a struggle. Is there maybe also a connection in this regard that these communities have struggled for their survival partly against Israel as well, and that now they are the most in solidarity with Palestine currently to their own physical detriment because they're being bombed by Israel? Ayman.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, but also in many ways, this is not. If we look at it historically, right? We see this this form of resistance, this violent resistance, this armed resistance, be spread across the region in different ways. At some point, it was through full nation armies, right? If we're talking about Egypt, if we're talking about Syria, if we're talking about even Jordan at some point. But the thing is that when we are talking about post-Oslo Accords, a lot of things changed in this moment. It paved the way to a possibility of a peace, right? But it did not really manifest. However, the fighting factions mostly put down their arms. The factions fighting for Palestine. But what we see now is factions that have refused to put their arms despite international sanctions. If we're looking at, and if we're looking really at the broad picture, because when you talk about the axis of resistance, so you didn't name it necessarily, but when you talk about the Shiite population in Lebanon and you link it to Yemen, you are intrinsically linking it to a broader axis of resistance that includes the Islamic resistance in Iraq and in Syria. This is an axis that formed outside of states, right? So these are non-state actors. Of course, and here is why there is also this this perspective on this axis of resistance being an Iranian proxy, or quote unquote the Iranian Iron Dome, right? Because they do not have an Iron Dome, right? But this becomes a form of resistance to American imperialism in the region. So when you look at something in this broad perspective, you can also translate it a bit back in time, and then in that case you will see that there was an axis of resistance. It did not it was not constituted so much of religiously driven, and I say this because you highlighted the Lebanese Shia population, and of course, yes, we see that today, we know this, but it did not mean that resistance did not exist outside of this population, especially previously in history. It was more mixed in several senses, and the reason I bring this up is because when governments put down their arms or governments sign treaties, so whether it is something like Saudi Arabia or currently with the Abraham Accords, something like a country like the United Arab Emirates or Morocco and so on, I believe Sudan was the third. We start to look at these states, these official entities, as being non-efficient or non-effective in armed struggle, whereas we see non-state actors, and of course we can call them the axis of resistance, but when Abu Ubaidah, the military spokesperson of Hamas, addresses resistance factions with gratitude or with thanks or with or just support, he also addresses the free of the world, who he calls free of the world, and not just him, but who are referred to as the free of the world. And in that, he is including people who are able to think freely and to speak freely about what is going on. And I feel that what has changed with this non-state actors, like this time around, is that it is no longer a state against a state or something where you can link it to political or economic. Of course, it can always be linked to politics and economics, but it's not something that a state takes a decision on the basis of its sanctions or economic needs, but it is rather an axis that is working on the basis of an idea, and that idea is transferable to other parts of the world. That idea is understandable or graspable by people in Europe or people in other parts of the world.
So would you also say that because of this, because it's not directed by a certain state interest, but really out of an idea that is felt by these communities, that it's a much more bottom-up principle of political power?
Yes, I would say that. But I also want to give space for Omar to give his input on
No,
this.
please. I'm listening very intensely.
So when you bring this up, of course, being from Lebanon, maybe you can also get more into specifics about the case of Hezbollah. And what I'm particularly curious about is to what extent is Hezbollah popular among the Lebanese Shiite communities, and to what extent is it popular in the rest of Lebanon? Is it strictly sectarian? Yeah.
Okay. I think we've had this conversation on the street at some point together in one of the protests where we met.
That's true.
It is not hidden that many parts of the Lebanese population have a lot of issues with not just Hezbollah, but any form of religiously driven resistance, right? And not we, but some people in Lebanon also remember or were alive during other forms of resistance, armed resistance, violent resistance, but not necessarily religiously driven. Hezbollah also comes from it was previously part of a larger sectarian movement, or at least when it formed as an Islamic resistance, of course, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't a sectarian resistance before that. The reason, and that is also a transferable idea, actually. So the reason why I put the highlight on it not being a state actor is because I felt, or I have come to understand through just looking at the history of the region, that in many cases states, very much like Egypt, in fact, moved. Of course, there were wars and several things, but it moved in its stance as a whole state. The axis of resistance doesn't move this way, and we can see it from what we're seeing right now. There is a certain level of grassroots coordination between these different factions. And I just want to point out that it's not always that Hezbollah, of course, always sought the fight for the rights of the Palestinians. That's certainly true, but it wasn't always true that Hezbollah and Hamas saw eye to eye. In fact, they did fight against each other at certain points. So it's important to remember these things, that the idea of a free Palestine also goes beyond these different factions' beliefs. Hamas is not a Shiite community, right? But and a lot of the Lebanese people who are not part of Hezbollah, who did not necessarily fully support Hezbollah, especially not in 2008, let's say, would still now, of course, support them in what is happening, at least in terms of popular opinion or public speaking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is, I think, also reflected in the foreign minister of Lebanon, basically saying that in terms of the current situation with Israel, they have the same position as Hezbollah, right? That was last week, I believe.
Sorry, say again. I was reading some of the comments. I should put this away.
So, last week, the foreign minister of Lebanon basically said that in terms of the current conflict with Israel, they agree, they have the same position as Hezbollah, the central government, which is maybe an interesting reflection of what you just said, that even though there are sectarian differences, in certain ways, people do like appreciate the fact that Hezbollah is willing to take on Israel.
Yes, and I
And
think in the current circumstances, being aligning ourselves with Hezbollah means aligning ourselves with the force that is trying to stop the genocide.
Yeah.
And since a few weeks ago, Hezbollah has always been referring to its actions as a support front, a support for the Palestinian people, for their plight. And
Since
it
a
was
year,
only,
right?
yes, of course, since a year, but up until a few weeks ago, before the direct attacks, starting with the pager attacks, I would say, I mean, that's when I time it, but other people could time it else a bit after that, maybe after the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. So when Hezbollah fully entered the war in its own front, that does not mean it has stopped its support front for Palestine, because they do make a distinction in their operations between what is a response to Israel's attacks in Lebanon and what is a part of their support operations.
Yeah. Omar, you wanted to jump in just then?
yeah, I think that that was a very important point a man just made. That you're completely correct, Sjoerd, that all of these resistance groups, let's say whether it be an Iran or a Yemen or a Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're supporting Sunnis, right? And I think that is already the best example that you can pick throughout the web. There's always so much hate and comments against one another, whether you're Sunni going against Shia or Shia going against Sunni. Tunisia is a country with 98% Sunni, stuck in their own ways, stuck with their own governments, let's say, unable to completely manifest a true voice of resistance through their government towards Israel. But I think the large consensus across the Middle East, whether they are Shia or Sunni, all of them can find their all of them can see themselves in the struggle for justice for the Palestinians. And I think this is one of the few things that has united the Middle East ever since the inception of Israel. And that always went, I believe, across, as you would say in America, party lines, or as we should call it in this context, across sectarian lines. And I think that is now also what we're seeing in Europe. It used to be something for only the activists. It used to be something for only the folks that were taking the time to read up about the situation, and else it was just easily disguised as, this is a difficult topic. It takes, it's not so black and white. There's different sides to this story. The only side that is now becoming very apparent to, I think, also the majority of people in the West, if we dispute some of the mainstream.
No, you're cutting out. Okay, maybe he'll get back in a second. I want to take the time then to read out a comment.
Read up on the history.
Okay, there you are again. You cut out for a second. Can you say that last part again?
Oh, apologies. Yeah, all I was saying is that what you now finally see is that this terrible event that has been happening now, these terrible sets of events that have been happening since the 7th of October, now a year ago, are inviting people to actually read up on the history of this conflict, of this oppression. I must say, it's not a conflict, obviously, And that is the thing that I think is going to be really making a difference. So this escalation, as worse as it is, I think, engaging people in a different level than it has in the fact, where, let's be frank, already more Palestinians have been killed in those previous conflicts, a lot of these previous conflicts, than Israelis have been killed on the 7th of October. But I think that's besides the point for now.
Yeah. Maybe to get back to Tunisia for a second, which you mentioned, I believe yesterday, there were presidential elections in Tunisia, and the guy who won was the incumbent. From what I gather, he's a very unpopular leader, but he was basically the only viable candidate, and he won with an extremely low turnout rate. So a small percentage, maybe 30% of the population, still seems to support him if you look at it like that. But I also read that he is, at least in rhetoric, extremely pro-Palestinian. But is there any way in which this pro-Palestinian sentiment has been expressed? Because, of course, at the United Nations General Assembly, the King of Jordan also said some pro-Palestinian things. But that doesn't change the fact that Jordan has been helping Israel shoot down missiles from Iran in April, for example.
Right. Warned them also warned them in advance. I mean, same goes for Sisi, same goes for a lot of Arab leaders. Unfortunately, they can talk on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are dependent on funds given to them by the World Monetary Fund. So, there is not a very direct, active gesture that Kais Saied, the current president and incumbent of this latest election, he has not taken any active stance in regards to the plight of the Palestinians. What is true is that Tunisians, for as long as the country has existed, have been in favor of the Palestinian cause, and also they do not simply recognize the illegal entity that we call Israel, right? So in their books, it's not even a country, just as I'm sure all three of us on this panel agree, it has no legitimacy to be an actual country. So Kais Saied has been following that line. The main line of Tunisian politicians, which I, in a sense, do not find a very troubling line, is that because we do not recognize the country, there is no way we are going to be engaging with this entity. And Tunisia has always supported the Palestinian cause, whether it's this Kais Saied or whether it's the former president or prime minister coming from the Islamic Ennahda party before, or even the former dictator Ben Ali, or the one who was one of the, let's say the founding father of Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba, was also in favor of the Palestinian cause. In fact, I believe it was somewhere in the 80s that when the Palestinians had to diverge from the Palestinian territories, they had their base close to Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, the PLO base, and it was actually illegally bombed by Israel with planes, resulting in various deaths. So I think the consensus in Tunisian society and across the political spectrum in Tunisia is that they are in favor of the Palestinians in their struggle for freedom and their own state. But I do not see Kais Saied taking, especially in this current political climate, any active steps towards justice for the Palestinians. I think he, at this very moment, has a lot of other things on his mind.
Yeah, so if we are talking about assistance to Palestine from other Islamic and or Arab countries, the elephant in the room is, of course, Iran. And from what I understand is across the Arab world, there has been until recently, and maybe there still is, a lot of anti-Iranian sentiment because of ethnic strife between Arabs and Persians. Once again, this is probably oversimplifying, but this history is there. And right now, Iran has shown itself to be the only major power willing to physically act against Israel. So do you see in any way that this is changing the perception of people from Arab countries towards the role Iran plays? Either of you?
Well, I'm not sure if it changes any of the ways the Arab countries are looking at this entire genocide happening, or even in their relation to Iran. I do think that it's an important stepping stone, though. I don't think that the moment in the past, Iran was always the boogeyman, let's say, right? And it was easy to portray it as such in the Western media, in debates, through various parliaments across the world. I think this is now the first time, not this attack, but the last attack before that. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was in August or in July when Iran last attacked. Perhaps it was even April. But that was the first time that I ever witnessed on Western media that the moment the Israeli politicians and spokespersons tried to run back to their famous narrative of no, but we're under attack, it was the first time that journalists actually confronted them and said, well, didn't you just bombard their consulate? Didn't you just attack another sovereign country? And I think it's an element in this whole implosion of their society, of the victimization that they themselves, are running their children through their educational system. If you have such a powerful country as an Iran bombing or trying to bomb Israel, and let's put aside for a fact that they warned not only Arab countries across the region, but also Russia and America before they did this latest attack, as if they were kind of still trying to keep folks safe in a sense. And then the moment the interviews start happening, people are not suddenly picking Israel's side, but they're starting to see that it's not all black and white. I think that is an amazing shift of narration that we have now entered in this in the way of how we talk about this conflict in the Western media. So I think that it was incredibly important for Iran to do these attacks as a way of saying, this is the red line. But I think it's even more so telling what the actual response there was from Western journalists towards Israeli politicians. I think personally the best example of how Israel is literally imploding from the inside out.
Yeah, it's interesting because the argument against the Iranian attack from last week was, well, there's been no civilian casualties. So from what evidence has been gathered, which has been really suppressed by the Israeli government, it seems that there has been a missile strike at least very close to Mossad headquarters, which is, of course, Israeli intelligence. That's a major PR blunder for Israel if this really gets out. And there's also evidence that an air base in the south, name of which I'm not going to try to pronounce, has been struck successfully with major damage to, for example, F-35 airplanes. And we can see that this really did make a dent in some way from headlines like this. If it wants to pop up, okay. It's really small. But it says...
before you go there, Sjoerd, it's interesting that the attack on the Mossad headquarters was right within a civilian population, right? So every time we talk about these human shields that Israel keeps accusing the Palestinians of, or Hezbollah for that matter, they literally have their secret service in the middle of a densely populated area. it's quite stunning, really. So of course they can't report about it.
Yeah, if they would admit it, that means admitting to the fact that the Iron Dome does not protect them anymore. But what's interesting is here at the UN, Netanyahu has said the Iranian attack has failed and we're going to avenge it. This is a contradiction, right? If it's failed, there's nothing to avenge. So that's I think, telling. And you can see that every time Israel calls something a precision strike, for example, putting 82,000-pound bombs to kill one guy, they call that a precision strike, and they kill like 1,000 people in collateral damage. And now Iran has structural military targets causing 0 civilian, or maybe 1 from Israeli air defense civilian casualty. So does this not also show a stark difference in regard for civilian life between the two countries? And contrary to all the Western propaganda, in this case, it's Iran which is more concerned about civilian life than Israel is. Right?
I would add to that just that it is the entire axis of resistance that is trying to act in this manner. Right? So even when Hezbollah threatened to attack civilians, if civilians in Beirut were attacked, this didn't really happen yet because they've been announcing their targets not as general cities, but rather as certain military bases, and they would say that this military base is close to this city or this military base is close to that city. And as you started with the example, no civilians were killed, and that's a good thing. The axis of resistance is not trying to target civilians. And I think by maintaining that moral standpoint in how they are fighting, they also maintain a higher ground.
It blows a hole in the narrative that they are killing people in Israel simply because they are Jews, because they are focusing specifically on people involved actively in the genocide. Something that bears mentioning, especially on this day, when 1 year ago 1,200 people were killed, actually 1,400 people, but they brought it down to 1,200 because they found out 200 of them were Palestinians, so they were like, okay, those don't count anymore. But they brought this number down. But of the 1,200 people who were killed, a very large number have been killed by the Israeli military, which is recognized by even Western media by now. I believe ABC Australia a week or two ago wrote an article basically copying all the things that the Grey Zone wrote back in October 2023.
Isn't there a word for this, by the way? Don't they have like a code name? I thought they had like a kind of code name where they just say, okay, now it's Operation...
Yes, the Hannibal
whatever
Directive.
Yeah, and then the soldiers are just allowed to fire rockets with their Apache helicopters if they suspect that somebody's being taken hostage, because they can't deal with the fact that they're going to have collateral against them. So they simply just decide to kill their own people. It's absurd.
The crazy part is that Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, he committed suicide rather than being captured. And people speculate that that is why it is named this. The doctrine is named like this. But the IDF says, here we go. The IDF says that the name is because they have a program that spits out random names for operations and doctrines, and that's how they labeled it.
Wait, what? Like a prompt? You just get a new...
Just a random word. Okay, Hannibal. Okay, this is the Hannibal Directive.
So sense. It is actually called Hannibal.
Yes, it's actually called that. But they argue that it's not necessarily about killing their captive military, but it is about using excessive force against positions. I mean, it's some kind of legalistic bullshit, so I don't know the exact wording. I hope in a second Ayman will return. He has not left the call, but maybe there's someone at the door or something. But what might also be interesting to talk about, you said that this current situation. Okay,
Sorry,
there you
I have
are.
to answer something.
Yeah, Omar, you just said that the current situation is causing Israel also to crumble from the inside. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see this taking place?
Right. Well, you'll have to excuse me. I should have read up about on a few Israeli historians, but really they are. I think they were the first ones to speak out. Some of them even being involved in the diplomatic team on the Israeli side during the Oslo Accords in the 90s. They're the first to mention, that this entire society has always been based on fear. We should not forget where these folks are coming from. These folks are, more literally, they're coming mostly from Europe, but they just endured an amazing, tragic genocide themselves. They were persecuted in Europe for years, tried to flee in search of a new homeland, and found themselves, in their own eyes, under some form of new oppression, new attack. And that's what did they do? They armed themselves. They fought their way through. They took more land. After some agreements in the 60s, they took even more land. They initiated wars. It has been an ongoing process, and their entire cult has been fixated on instilling this fear in their society. And this starts from a young age, right? And the victimization also starts from a young age. And then the moment that people turn 18, 19, they go into service. So you basically have an entire society that is in large part feeling that they are under constant attack. Let's dispute for a second the fact that they are doing the attacking 99% of the time. But that's all they got. Right. And I think that is also why you now see them escalate as much as they are escalating. The furthest they have ever escalated, and I think the biggest atrocity of our times in real time that we are witnessing with Western weapons as well. So I quoted an Israeli historian. Once again, I'll have to look up who it was. It wasn't Max Blumenthal. I'll have to look him up.
I think so.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, could be. Yeah, he said in one of the latest interviews with Al Jazeera, latest interviews like one of a few months ago, that it's going to end, but unfortunately, before it ends, it's going to get worse. And this is what you see historically speaking with all empires, and let's definitely consider Israel part of an empire here. It's going to escalate even further before it implodes, but we are starting to see the first cracks now, and they might not see it yet, but we'll see it. And how I see this going forward is it's not going to end within now and 5 years after the end of this genocide, but I'm going to give it another 10 and maybe 15 at most. But there's going to come a time where the walls are going to fall, where we're going to yell, tear down this wall on the borders of the West Bank. And I am very convinced that we are going to be able to witness this within our lifetime.
Yeah, the big question, of course, is, and yeah, we have also been talking about this on these streams, this seems to be the inevitable ultimate outcome, but in the meantime, how many people are gonna have to die, and how far will Israel go in, of course, the throttle is up to 100 in Gaza, and it's the heat is getting turned up in the West Bank and now in southern Lebanon as well. Is it plausible that Israel will first destroy all of the West Bank and all of Lebanon before this Zionist nightmare, as I believe Gabor Mate called it, is finally over? How do people?
I mean,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
if I may, I mean, personally, what I think is a very important symbol or sign to look out for in the next coming of years is the moment that we in the West, and we're starting to see this kind of, let's call it enlightenment, right? Even if it's in small portions, we're starting to see the first break of dawn in that sense. At least I am. The moment that we stop talking about a two-state solution is the moment that I think that we are going to definitely find an acceleration of this process, where we're going to continue the moment that we start talking about a one state. That is the moment that is not going to. That is the moment that the narrative is going to shift from, oh yeah, our people deserve a state, their people deserve a state, to these people deserve a state with equal rights for all, regardless of ethnicity, religion, you name it. You know, the way it was before the Zionists came right after the First World War. So I think that is a very important sign to look out for. And I think that the moment that we see that we're starting to talk more about the one-state solution instead of a two-state solution that was already lost in the first few years after Netanyahu's escalation, right after the Oslo Accords, I think is going to be very telling. Amen, please.
I mean, to that, I would just add a fact that I find interesting, which is what you described is a preference outlined in the Hamas charter from 2007, I believe.
Can you elaborate on that?
They have a clear outline charter of several things where they have an introduction. They introduce the people of the land, in which they do include, of course, Jewish people as well, and they eventually, in one of the sections, talk about their vision for the future of Palestine, and it is a free Palestine from the river to the sea, as we are saying in the protests, and they outline that it is a free country for all of its citizens with equal rights, and all of its citizens is the citizens that they defined in the introduction, including Jewish people. So I just say this again just to break this idea of, that's constantly propagated.
Wait, so the Hamas charter mentioned they wanted a unified Palestine with equal rights for Jewish people as well.
They said for everyone, regardless of your religion.
Okay.
And regardless, I mean, they did even go a step further. They said regardless of your political affiliation, which technically probably might mean, technically could mean even if you are against their political movement.
Yeah.
There is space for you to exist and to have a hand in forming this. And they defined Palestine for its historic citizens, and they defined historic citizens to include people of Jewish origin as well. Now, they also did define that they are fighting Israelis not on the basis of their religion, but rather based on the fact that they are settler occupiers. So they also, of course, define very clearly that they want an end to the occupation. What that means, an equal state for everyone, where the rights are with equal rights and with properly shared land. That's one vision, but I'm not going to elaborate further. But I found it very interesting that it is there in the charter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's there's a lot of implicit positions of Hamas which really go contrary to narratives about it as a political movement. For example, the likening to ISIS is downright ridiculous because within Hamas-controlled Gaza, there have been actively working churches for Christian Palestinians. I'm not aware of any ISIS-controlled community where they allowed Christians to practice their faith. So that blows away that narrative. But there's, of course, because of the predominant Islamic faith conviction of Palestinians, a very strong religious component in the solidarity with Palestine, which you can see also in non-Arab Muslim communities going as far as Indonesia and Malaysia. But do you see this whole situation, if you may call it that, taking place in Palestine right now, to, even though at an extremely high human price, bring does it in some way still bring the various peoples of at least the Middle East closer together politically over a shared political agenda for the liberation of Palestine?
The people of the Middle East or the free thinkers of the world, I would say yes. Linking it necessarily to religion, I find it just falls apart when I see countries like the United Arab Emirates, let's say, right? So it just falls apart for me. It's not the basis of this, despite the fact that the resistance is an Islamic resistance. Okay, aside from that, in terms of popular belief among the people of these nations, that can also be something else. But then I wouldn't say it's on the basis that they have a bond in religion. I would say it's on the basis of these are the people who are able to think and speak freely.
Yeah.
Sorry, you cut out at the last sentence.
I would say that what's going to bring people together around this topic is not necessarily religion, but I see it more as people who are able to think and speak freely.
Right.
People who are not able to speak freely or voice their opinions freely in certain Arab nations, Arab Islamic nations, are of course not taking part in this strife. Not even vocally, not even online.
And
but I think, Sjoerd, what you mentioned about Ireland earlier, as they are familiar with their struggle, and Spain, of course, with their difficult past, but also South Africa. I mean, I think if you look at all of the countries that have been going through similar events, they are all the biggest supporters of Palestine to this day, and I think that gives you the best idea on what side of history you are on. And I agree with that man that I think it's not a religious battle in any sense of the word, unless you want it to become a religious battle, and you only have to oppress people for so long that they're going to find their solace in different ways. So if you want to radicalize people, put them in an apartheid system, make sure that before they can get to their farm, they have to travel 3 hours instead of what used to be like 20 years ago, 20 minutes. And you will radicalize them and they will find their solace in religion. But that does not make this a religious battle in any stretch of the imagination. It's a battle of the oppressed fighting the oppressors. And it so happens to be that they are Muslim, mostly.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. What I meant by that is not necessarily that religion is at the root of this, but rather that for oppressed peoples, unifying ideologies can become their rallying call for resistance, whether that be Shia Islam or the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood roots of Hamas, or like whatever ideology can unify, legitimize, and motivate resistance against oppression. And something that's also interesting, now that you mentioned this, which is very much not known in the West as well, is that, at least nowadays, is that the resistance, the Palestinian resistance back for 50 years ago was mostly not Islamic at all, but Marxist. And is there maybe something in this history that you, either one of you wants to touch on or elaborate on? or basically mentioning this enough contextualization?
What was that? Mossadegh was the former Iranian president, right? The former Iranian president, or
Yeah, Prime
yeah, I think it
Minister.
was
Yeah.
prime minister, that was democratically elected by the Iranian people after they got rid of the Shah the first time.
Yeah,
Okay,
he was
so
more like a
let's.
conservative nationalist, right?
Right. Well, he wasn't religious in any sense of the imagination. He was not
Oh.
he was not even close to the current Islamic regime that you have in power for the last 30 plus years. So that, I think, that is the best example that you can give in this context. That the moment that we start meddling in the development or the evolution, let's say, of a society, people are getting rid of their oppressor, and the moment that we put that oppressor back in power because we think it will serve our national interests, it's going to backfire in your face. And it's not only going to backfire for you, it's going to backfire for these poor people. A society has been thrown back decades in their well, let's say, in a way, social enlightenment, all because that with the moment that we saw something that was turning against our interests, we tried to meddle and put a dictator back in power. And I think that is the best example that you can use in this specific context as well.
Yeah, so basically the same thing happened in Palestine. You mentioned that Palestinian leadership was in the 70s in Tunisia, where they were assassinated by the Israeli Air Force. These were of the PLO, right?
PLO, yeah.
So
I think it was in the 80s. Correct me if I'm wrong. Perhaps the
okay,
70s.
I don't have the dates exactly on that, but the secular socialist Palestinian resistance was, at least the leaders, were deliberately assassinated by Israel, leaving no more space, at least decreasing the political space for that kind of resistance and fostering Islamic resistance instead. So
you know,
if
it reminds me. Sorry.
yeah, if you look at polls that were done, don't ask me how, but I believe in November or very early on in this currently ongoing genocide in the Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank, a majority of people maybe don't necessarily support Hamas. Well, now they do if you ask them upright, which party do you support? But the more interesting part to me was, for most people, it was not so much the fact that they support Hamas. They support armed resistance.
They support the resistance.
So the
Absolutely.
point is that it is impossible to destroy Hamas in the sense that's why it exists. Even if they destroy the whole organizational apparatus of Hamas, there still will be armed resistance because it is a necessity of life at this point for them. Do you agree?
See, I think personally, if I may, um, I think personally that that's exactly why I said at the beginning of this talk that October 7th was the beginning of the end. You know, just like you said, it doesn't fit their narrative to show that there are actually circular citizens there. The way Netanyahu loves to portray it is that it's us against it's us as a civilization against barbarism. This is how he always likes to frame it. This is how he always portrays it in every interview. It's us against them, these barbers that they have no decency. And I think that the most beautiful thing to point out here is the famous writer Edward Said, the Christian Palestinian that wrote amazing books on the oppression of the Palestinians and about Palestinian history and Arabic language and culture in general. But he said something very poignant, that he was invited for a panel discussion with Netanyahu somewhere in the 80s when he was still, I think, lead of some ministry. And we all know Edward Said, you know, like a very friendly, calm person. And Netanyahu last minute declined to enter the panel. And when Edward Said asked why, Netanyahu apparently responded, because he wants to kill me. That was his response to Edward Said, a Christian Palestinian, you could call him peace activist, but at least like a peaceful writer, you know, to say the least. And Netanyahu, even at that time, this was in the 80s, knew that if he was going to sit down with this secular person that was completely different than, you know, whatever he loved to portray, or they would love to portray in Israel about the Palestinians, the dehumanization of the Palestinians, it wasn't going to fit the narrative. And I think one of the cracks that are now starting to show is that people are starting to look at Palestinians as people, as normal people like you and me. And I think that is the major shift that is now slowly but surely happening.
Yeah. Yeah, this is what I earlier wanted to get at when I said that the way Palestine is being covered, the genocide is being covered in the media right now, is very much looking at a phenomenon, pictures which are awful, of people torn to shreds, people looking for their relatives under the rubble, houses being destroyed, and then showing this as a way of making the point, look what terrible injustice is going on. But the implication of that would be to say that if the oppression of the Palestinians did not take this shape, but kept going on the way it did until October 6th, everything would be fine. So what this has done is, at an extremely high price, it has made Palestine visible and the Palestinian cause visible. So I was a bit more cynical about this, like just pointing out that this is just a way to address things that happen. So to look at people are suffering, which is bad, but not get into why this is happening. But Omar, I believe you said just now that this is still causing people to look into what is happening. And even though the media don't tell them why this is happening,
The genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah, this
you know?
triggers people to look into this. So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. But do you think, both of you, maybe Ayman can jump in first then, that this is part of the calculation made by Hamas?
Okay. First, I will just say that what you just mentioned about what you were just mentioning about the approach of the Palestinian resistance versus the viewing it as resistance versus viewing it as a dehumanized element that you can attack, right? If we're starting from here and we look at what the rockets represent, sorry, because something you said reminded me of something that something you said about Israel's wish to return to October 6th, kind of going to that status quo, that slow genocide, basically. That sorry, that just the idea that going back to something like October 6th would be acceptable to most Israelis at the moment, or even before now, in and of itself, for me, signals something. It was something brought up by Ihab Jabbarin, Palestinian analyst. It also brought to mind something that else that he said, but also rang true with something that Norman Finkelstein had said before, which is what the rockets that Hamas sends out represent, because they sent out a symbolic hit on Tel Aviv today. Um, Norman Finkelstein had once described these rockets as an SOS flare to the world, right? Because they, the capacity of causing serious damage or resisting through an armed struggle through this capacity will not necessarily lead to a military victory, right? However, these rockets, when they're seen as a political message, be it to the world as an SOS flare, let's say, or in the words of Ihab Jabbarin, a political message to Israel that even after one whole year of genocide, you cannot accomplish what you wanted to accomplish militarily. We can still send rockets. We're still here and we're still choosing the path of resistance. I think in that sense, it clarifies these different approaches to dealing with the situation. Um, sorry, did I go off on a tangent outside?
No.
Do you wanna? Okay.
Now that
Do
you
you wanna
bring this,
lead me back in?
yeah, now that you bring this up, that reminds me, also tying into a comment Theo wrote, basically saying if Israel can't beat Hamas in Gaza, why do they expect they're going to beat Hezbollah in Lebanon? And the interesting part is that the reason they're giving, that Israel is giving for going into Lebanon right now, is because in Lebanon, South Lebanon, Hezbollah is firing rockets at military bases in northern Israel, and because of this, 60, 70, 80,000, I've heard different numbers, but this is the range of Israeli civilians living in these areas have been evacuated, and they want them to return home. So to decode that, the objective is to make sure Hezbollah loses its ability to fire rockets into Israel. But after 1 year, they haven't even managed to disable Hamas from firing rockets from Gaza, which is, of course, much smaller. And from what I understand, the tunnel networks are much smaller as well in Gaza, and the terrain is much more suitable for defensive warfare and guerrilla warfare in Lebanon because it's very mountainous. So, is this operation that Israel is starting in Lebanon now doomed to fail, and what will be the outcome, or what might be the outcome?
Their ground operation, you mean?
Yes.
I mean, their ground operation has not really. I mean, on the ground, they haven't really done anything in terms of. They've done a lot from the sky. They've killed a lot of people. Of course, they've damaged a lot of things, and most probably a lot of military capacity for Hezbollah. Not to say that they're not doing that. It's not. But on the ground, if you look at, there was a very good analysis by John Elmer actually recently on the Anti-Empire Project, I believe, where he explains what you're talking about in terms of the geography of Lebanon. And I think also by Justin Pador, they also go into this looking at where Israel is trying to enter Lebanon and how. What they haven't been successful in that so far, and in 2006, the main battles on the borders were happening in a city called Bint Jbeil, versus now they're not even being able to get to that city yet. They are stopping at previous border towns and retreating back when they are faced by the resistance. What we do see today, for example, was the full engagement of the Israeli Navy in the attempt to infiltrate from the south. However, this was something I was just looking at right before this session started. I still have the news tab open. I can check it now, but as far as I know, nothing has resulted of that yet. What we see more of, I mean, right now, what I'm reading off the breaking news is more attacks from the sky. And with that, we know that Israel, of course, has the upper hand. And they will use that not necessarily to actually accomplish any military goals, but what they do hope in creating is a refuse, or rather, in a way that Hezbollah or the resistance in general starts to lose its community's embrace. When this community has had enough of all of this death, it might at some point have to start saying to Hamas or to Hezbollah or to the axis of resistance, stop. We can't. So this is kind of a tactic that Israel follows and has been following it for a very long time, but it didn't really work with the secular resistance, and it didn't really work with the current axis of resistance.
So this is basically the Dahiya doctrine you're referring to, right?
Dahi doctrine is more referring to literally the southern suburb of Beirut, where they carpet bombed it in a certain. So Dahi means suburb, and when we say the suburb in Beirut, it usually refers to the southern suburb, which mostly gets all the hits of Israel when we're talking about hits in the region of Beirut.
Yeah, but the Israeli military policy that this refers to is basically what you're describing.
That they carpet bomb the area.
Destroy the communities upon which the resistance relies to destroy the support for the resistance.
Yeah.
Which, like you mentioned, actually hasn't worked. So could you say that this military operation does not have military goals and also does not have foreign political goals, which would be to undermine the support of Hezbollah, which probably won't happen, but has purely domestic political goals? So they can put images on TV to their own, basically, genocidal population, saying, look, we're doing something.
Would you like to go first, Omar, or shall I?
Well, I'm very curious about your opinion, Aman, but like I said earlier, I don't think that they're looking for a solution. I think their only option they have right now, given the society that they live in, their only way forward is to escalate. If they were genuine about finding a solution for what has been happening since October 7th, they would have struck a hostage deal, And Hamas has been very forward-coming in, accommodating such a deal. That was, excuse me, quote unquote, the idea of Joe Biden. They are not interested in a deal. They're not interested in one of these solutions. They simply have no direction going forward. The only thing that they have is Western weapons and means of escalating. And I genuinely believe that if the moment they would strike a deal, the moment that people have the oxygen to come to their senses, it won't just happen in the West, but I think a large portion of also Israelis will choose to decide inevitably to live in a one state. And those who don't will simply fuck off back to New York, where they came from to start with. And I think that is the final solution, just like we saw in South Africa. I think it's inevitable. And I think the moment that you're going to see an end to this conflict is also the moment that it's going to be evident that there was never an end goal, not with Gaza, not with Lebanon. If they would be attacking Lebanon, they would have attacked Iran. Anything to keep the escalation going, that's the only thing keeping them alive right now. Alive in the sense of, I don't mean physically, but alive as the Zionist entity. Exactly. Making it a viable Zionist entity.
So who's next then after Lebanon?
We're not going to get past Lebanon.
Past Gaza, so...
Sorry, say, go ahead.
So the thing that is very attainable for Israel in both Lebanon and Gaza is, which is why this is not, okay, this is going to lead to a military defeat for Israel, but it's not something to celebrate in any way, because what they can achieve is inflicting a very, very, very large number of civilian casualties, which they're already doing. So yeah, I want to get that out there, but go ahead, what you wanted to say.
Uh, I wanted to say that I do agree with you in the sense that it has a goal, it has a political goal, internal, whether it's only internal or not. I put a small question mark on this because I'm not so sure that there isn't an American political goal in this sense, and possibly an economic goal also. Um, I mean, the American empire thrives on maintaining a active war machine, and Israel, being a colony of the American empire, is a space to activate that war machine and to test out that war machine and to sell it as battle-tested weapons. It is not really a very big secret that Netanyahu, at least in his, and I'm saying Netanyahu because I really don't know much about previous Israeli leaders, not tactics, but more like strategy. It seems that his strategy is, and I quote this, and I'm translating also from Ihab Jabbarin, the analyst I was speaking of, that said Netanyahu runs forward. He doesn't run away. He runs away from something, but forward into something else. And that's the only way to maintain a continuous war. And the thing is that they are now talking about this, of course, a continuous war up until the next possibly American elections, right? Because it's very much affected by that. Not to say that it's a battle between it's not about Republicans or Democrats necessarily in that sense, and I do agree on that. Both parties would very much like to keep Israel, but how they choose to keep it, right? I believe it was Kennedy that did threaten to stop arms shipments to Israel. We see this trickling in the European Union with France announcing yesterday, I believe, that and inviting other European nations to stop providing weapons to Israel, selling or giving. And I think beyond all of this, so Netanyahu's response, political response to Macron was Israel will win with or without you. Regardless of what he said, there are a lot of views that point to the idea that Israel is not winning. It has been constantly militarily losing. Even in terms of the economics of war, it has been losing compared to what it has put in and what its weapons cost and what the resistance is putting in and what their weapons cost. Eventually, of course, the bigger price that is being paid by the resistance is in terms of lives and in terms of infrastructure and civilian destruction, the civilian infrastructure destruction. The key turning point that I think this analyst was pointing to is that today the Israelis in Tel Aviv have had to go to the shelters in the morning and at night. And that sounds like a tiny impracticality, right, compared to what is going on. However, I would say Israeli society, and that's what the analyst was also referring to, Israeli society is not willing to live the rest of its days in this manner. I don't think they do want, even no matter how much they might in this moment hate the idea of a Palestinian state, even if they will not vote for a Palestinian state, let's say it that bluntly, right? I don't think they want to exist in a world where there is no feeling of safety, where all of this armament, after a year of fighting, still cannot guarantee safety to the people of the capital. I think they are reaching the tipping point of saying we need something that will guarantee safety, and it's starting to look like a diplomatic resolution.
Is this also why you could argue that Israel, as a ethno-supremacist entity, cannot continue to exist physically as long as militant resistance groups in Palestine and in Lebanon, and now also in Yemen and in Iraq and in Syria, are still active, and specifically Hamas. So as long as Hamas exists, Israeli society cannot fulfill its basic promise to its own population, which is that the people don't have to go into bomb shelters in the morning.
I'd say even if Hamas does not exist, it's not necessarily only Hamas. As we said, there was resistance before Hamas, and there will probably, if Hamas is obliterated, the idea of resistance will be nurtured by the presence of oppression.
Yeah.
If oppression is there, resistance will inevitably be present. Nobody wants to live under oppression, right? So if we just look at it in that kind of philosophical, I know it might sound like I'm simplifying, but really on that level, whether resistance is by a small action of going into your field by force, like what happens in West Bank all the time, the farmers try to go back into their fields and they're stopped by settlers, and the settlers are supported by the IDF, and so on and so forth. Resistance will keep on taking different forms. It's even if it's peace marches, like the march of return that they were organizing in Gaza, and that
in 2018, right?
2018, I think, and it went on for almost a year, if I'm not mistaken. Yani, of course, there was a lot of violent things happening, but I think there's a documentary by Abby Martin specifically around this, or it starts around that. I think resistance is inevitable, and I think Israeli society, at least some in Israeli society, whether they have started to see and accept this, whether they like it or not, or how they choose to deal with it. You know, it could be somebody who is very much pro the genocide, and they see that, okay, this is the only way is to genocide them, and that it's a terrible thing, what I'm saying, but it could be a legitimate point of view to somebody for them. But the idea that resistance will always be there, this is the important part. This is what I think people should realize, or should just grasp. It's never going to end.
Former military leaders have also elaborated on it, specifically this point, right, where they actually announced, where they actually pointed out in interviews that if we were the Palestinians, we would fight at least as hard as they would. You know, so it's these former military veterans that are actually speaking in power of the Palestinians and not against them, which I already thought was I don't know, in a way, quite an extraordinary turning point.
Even Ariel Sharon said an occupation is not sustainable.
Yeah, even he came to his senses in his own way at some point. Yeah.
Well, it's not necessarily a pro-Palestinian point of view, I think, but more a recognition of real power politics. So they understand that the existence of a Palestinian people in the land of Palestine and the existence of a Zionist entity in the land of Palestine are mutually exclusive. So if both exist in this space at the same time, ultimately this will, no matter what, and it's not because the figure of Benjamin Netanyahu is now prime minister, but because of this historical contingency, at some point this conflict will have to be fought to its point of resolution, where either one of the two is destroyed, either the Palestinian people or the Zionist entity, I believe. And it seems to me that there is no other way to get out of this. There is no UN resolution which is going to undo all of this, because the UN does not have an army to make anything happen. So no matter how tragic this is, it is my view, and it has become increasingly my view, that what is going on in Palestine right now is a conflict that will be fought to its ultimate conclusion, and that this is a conflict that cannot be won by the Zionist entity, for the simple reason that this is a people who have in large part come to this place to live a life of luxury, of Western standard of living, but also while having the possibility to basically play cowboy in the Middle East. And as soon as this becomes impossible, because, well, like you said, even the supposedly safe city now has air alarms going off. As long as this myth is destroyed, which is happening right now, people will leave there. It will become demographically unviable. It will become economically unviable. It is increasingly becoming diplomatically unviable, which will ultimately mean that it must become militarily unviable. However, a lot of lives of Palestinian people, and increasingly now as well Lebanese people, are going to be destroyed in this process. And I'm hoping that either one of you can bring a somewhat more optimistic view of how this may unfold in the future than what I just laid out. Otherwise, well, this might be the conclusion to end on today. So both of you go ahead and give your final thoughts on what we have just discussed and what has been happening in Palestine over the past year, and where it's headed.
So I'd like to give the last word to Aman. So I'll take the floor. I think what is going to be incredibly important going forward is to see exactly the amount of pressure coming from the Israel lobby on Kamala Harris if she wins the election. I mean, if she doesn't win the election, God knows. I might even think that in some ways Donald Trump has perhaps a better chance of creating history here. But I think that we all three of us in this panel at least agree that the sole reason why Israel still exists to the extent that it does to this day is because of America. So I think it's going to be incredibly important to look out for developments in the US with regards to the oppression of the Palestinian people, because if they don't turn with their veto power, none of the other bigger countries are going to turn. But by that same token, let's remember that the majority of the people in the world are already on the right side of history. They have been when it came down to South Africa, and they are in when it comes down to Palestine. The vast majority also in the United Nations votes in favor of Palestine and in sanctions for Israel. And perhaps I would like to end also with what Desmond Tutu just said not too long ago, is that he actually mentioned that the apartheid regime that the Palestinians have been going through over the last decades is actually worse than what has been happening to the South African population over all those years. So I think the truth is inevitable. I think the vast majority of the people are already seeing it. I think it's just going to be incredibly important to take a good look at what America will be doing and deciding going forward these next few years.
All right, Ayman.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say again that there's a very close reference with what you just said, Omar, with something that was said by one of Hamas's political spokespeople in Beirut yesterday, Khalil Hayy. He said something quite similar in that sense. And it's interesting for me to hear these. And the reason why I mentioned this is it's interesting for me to be able to hear this from a very different perspective. right? Like, yeah, we say we all agree on certain things and that they are obvious to us, but then hearing them uh, come back from the voices of the resistance, or of the representatives of the resistance, for me gives more validity to this, that we among each other can see this as valid and truthful, and then the voices directly from within the resistance also see this as valid and truthful. So I think there's a value in that. The second thing, or where I was thinking of saying before I heard what you had to say, Omar, was um, you know, from a very different perspective. I was once told by a Zionist that Israel will never fall as an entity, right? As that kind of ethno-suprematist entity. And if it will, then all the nations of the world must fall before that happens. Right? It's just an intense emotional position, right? But then when I heard it, it also seemed like a very hopeful position. May all borders fall. Yes, may we all live equally. And okay, it sounds very romantic to say something like that, or idealistic. But in many ways, if the struggle to liberate, to truly liberate the land of Palestine from the river to the sea, does push the idea of equality across all borders, that can be the start of something really big. So that to me is yeah, something also worth fighting for.
All right. Thanks, both of you. And this is actually, I would say, very unprofessional of me, but right now, something popped to mind that would really be a loss if we didn't briefly discuss, and that is, of course, 2 weeks ago now, the former leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, was assassinated by Israel using 160 tons of bombs. If you could very briefly say something about how his death and his role is perceived in Lebanese society, because of course the Western narrative is, oh, this is a liberation for Lebanon that he was killed.
Very briefly, I can say that no matter how much I could have reasons to disagree with a lot of the things that Hezbollah propagated inside of Lebanon, I have many different reasons to not agree with so many different political directions. But the figure of Hassan Nasrallah specifically, because you're referring to his assassination, he was an incredibly charismatic figure, of course, and an incredibly truthful figure, and a figure that people believed, genuinely believed. I believe in some cases, even the Israelis would sooner believe him than their own leaders, in some cases. Anyway, regardless of those things where we might not agree with Hezbollah's internal politics in Lebanon, I would still say that the way this resistance movement and his person specifically that was seen, or his loss, the loss of this figure, was seen as a great loss, not only to Lebanon, but also to the axis of resistance in general. And also, in another way, it was a great incentive. Sorry, it was a great incentive for people to stand more in solidarity with the resistance. The resistance loses leaders, and they are proud of this. They are proud that their leaders die in the battle, just as their soldiers do. And this is not something that means it's not a heavy blow for the resistance. Of course, it's a very heavy blow, and it is something that Hezbollah is still recovering from, I would imagine. but it does not mean that because Israel has always also took on this tactic of assassinations. And they have yet to realize that it fails. It fails, just as the trying to destroy the civilian infrastructure and the civilian the communities not just acceptance, embrace of the resistance. They try to destroy this. The communities resolve, and they try to destroy a resistance by targeting its leaders. Those tactics that Israel constantly tries to apply often backfire. And I think that what they think they might have accomplished, because they did live, at least the Israeli leadership, did relish in this orgasmic moment of having killed Hassan Nasrallah. I think it was honestly short-lived, even in their own heads. I think if they are truly honest with themselves, they can kind of already tell that this is not a military accomplishment, that it will not lessen the people's support of the idea of armed resistance. And in fact, I think everything that Israel has done so far since October 7th last year has only really instilled the idea that armed resistance is right now, at this current stage of things, seems like the only guarantee of our actual safety and freedom.
All right. Well, that sounds like a realistic note to end on. The best we can do from where we are is, of course, try to do as much as we can to undermine the support for this genocidal project in our own societies. For now, I hope that this almost 2 hours we have just spent talking about this has done its part in contributing to this effort. So thank you very much, Ayman, and thank you very much, Omar, for joining me on this live stream this evening to talk about these important issues and the liberation of Palestine. So for now, to close it, om af te ronden, zou ik zeggen, mocht de wereld nog niet zijn vergaan, dan ben ik er volgende week weer. En dan waarschijnlijk weer met Koen, dus tot dan.